Okay, welcome everybody to our panel event webinar on tackling racism against First Nations people. I'm going to, first of all, hand over to Professor Jacqueline Troy to acknowledge country. Jackie.
So we're all meeting on different countries today. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, and I think the important thing that we need to think about today is to acknowledge communities everywhere and their stand against racism, institutionalised and in their own personal spaces, and how elders past and present continue to keep us strong and support all of us, whether we're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or otherwise, to go forward in good faith and in a supportive, community-based approach to each other now and into the future. So wherever you come to us, from whatever country you're on today, we acknowledge the people of the country that you're on, and I in particular acknowledge that Sydney University stands its main campus on the land of Gadigal people, and I have the Gadi behind me today to remind me that they are the people of this beautiful Xantharia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm Julie Robotham, and I'm going to be facilitating the webinar today. I'm very privileged to work with Professor Pat Dudgeon at the Centre of Best Practice, and I'm joining today also from Gadigal country, from Sydney University. In a moment, I'm going to introduce each panellist individually, and they'll each make some comments that address our theme today, and then they're going to come together for a discussion. And after that, there will be time for the panellists to address questions from the audience. So please post your questions by clicking on the Q&A button, and you can address those questions either individually to a panelist or to the panel as a whole. Now I'm going to reintroduce Professor Jacqueline Troy. Jackie is a Ngarigu woman from the Snowy Mountains region, and she's the Director, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research at the University of Sydney. Jackie's a linguist and a historian whose research focuses on documenting and reviving Indigenous languages, and she's interested in the use of Indigenous research methodologies and community-engaged research practices. Over to you, Jackie.
So today, I guess what I'm going to bring to the panel is, I guess what I would call a lived experience of racism in Australia. And I start by saying that when we were talking about this panel discussion initially, that we all shared that there are many different forms that racism takes, and that if you're an Aboriginal person, irrespective of where you were born, where your country is, whether you were born on your country or off your country, there's much made of things like skin colour, whether that makes a difference. It certainly does in some places, and your experience of life in general. But I can say honestly that my own experience as an Aboriginal person in Australia has been one where as soon as people know that you're Aboriginal, there are many, many particularly institutionalised racist practices that immediately come into place. And one of them in particular that I found very disturbing when I had my daughter in the early 2000s, and then she started school in I think about 2006, 7, and it was just around the time that the intervention kicked in, not as it was known. So this was the government's response to an incident in the Northern Territory, which was terrible in itself, but then was taken to be a sort of a typical feature of Aboriginal communities all over Australia, whether you were from the southeast, as I am, or from Central Australia, where the incident happened, far north, far west, Queensland, it didn't matter where you were from. The government suddenly had this idea that all Indigenous people needed an intervention in their lives to keep us safe from ourselves. And a particular effect was on Aboriginal men who became characterised as being poor family members, to say the very least, that given to violence, irrational violence, and that our children weren't safe and our women weren't safe. Now, across all communities in Australia, there is no doubt that there is a percentage of people, and it's the same, it wouldn't matter where you are in the world, the same percentage of people are people who commit these kinds of crimes. Our communities actually, if anything, have lower incidences because we have communal practices and that protect us as a people from excessive social, you could say, negative social engagements, I'm going to say. So we don't do bad things to each other as a rule. But when my daughter started school, the first thing that happened was that I was brought into the school to develop an Indigenous education plan, which was a direct result, actually, of the intervention. So this is around that time. And it was because there was an assumption that Aboriginal parents would not bring their children to school on time, if to school at all, that the children would not succeed in core subject areas like maths and literacy, mathematical and I guess you could say written literacy. Written literacy. There are lots of other literacies as well that we're very good at, like visual literacies. But there was this assumption that we just wouldn't succeed. So my daughter had this education plan developed, and I had to sit in a room with 8 people, all judging me. And at that time, as a mother, as an Aboriginal mother, and expecting me not to support my child at school. And she actually benefited in some ways from it because she was put into special classes where Aboriginal children were all put together. And she said it was really nice. It was very communal. The teachers were lovely to her, but it then meant that when she was out in the wider school, somehow she was not going to be treated as being equal to the other children and the other students. And the other thing that happened to me was that I became quite intimidated by the school. And at that stage, I was actually writing the Australian curriculum for languages. So I was very involved in developing our national curriculum, but I was still treated as inadequate in our local school environment. The other thing that I found raising my daughter is that she has this fear of police and authority, particularly that sort of policing and authority. So recently in Canberra, we were driving along the road and she was looking for somewhere to park. She was driving and some police pulled up beside us. And she was so traumatized by them saying, "Why are you slowing down? What are you doing?" And she was simply looking for a park. Now, whether they'd recognized us as Aboriginal or not, I have no idea. But she had this trauma response to the police that took her, she just couldn't keep driving. She had to move forward, get out, and I had to take over driving. And she was traumatized for hours afterwards. Another incident recently, we were crossing a place where there'd been an accident, a big intersection in Canberra. And I followed the line of traffic that was going through, and the policeman directing the traffic seemed to be waving me down. So I stopped and he yelled at us, keep going, keep going. And again, Lara had this response that for some hours later, she couldn't stop sobbing and feeling traumatized. Now, in talking to her about this, and through her life, there have been other incidents as well. I mean, I've had terrible encounters with the police myself. She has, like a lot of Aboriginal children and Aboriginal young adults, a terrible fear of people that we should actually be feeling that we can be safe with and relying on for protection. And this is also because she knows that the incidents of police, I'm going to say brutality towards Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people is almost par for the course. It's just understood that the police are adversarial to us. Now, that's not how it is for most police. It's not how it should be. But these are the kinds of things that have become, have made places that should be safe and people that should be safe for us unsafe. So for me, I guess that's my contribution, is that it doesn't matter how well educated, how well off you could say financially, what your position in society is, if you're Aboriginal, and people know that you're Aboriginal, and you feel Aboriginal in a particular situation, then a fear of being treated with racism and victimization will kick in, and it makes the quality of your life and your ability to operate without fear in society very compromised.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you particularly for sharing such powerful and personal experiences and very shocking experiences. I think that's really, really essential to orient us to the topic today. Just a reminder to those who are listening in that the Q&A is open for audience questions to Jackie and any of the other panellists, which we'll answer later in the webinar. Now I'm going to introduce Professor Pat Dudgeon. Pat's a Bardi woman from the Kimberley, and she's the director of the Centre of Best Practice in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention at the University of WA. She's also a chief investigator on an NHMRC Million Minds mission grant called Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing. Pat's a psychologist, and she led the highly influential Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Evaluation Project, known as PATSISP, which systematically documented for the first time the role of colonisation and trauma in Indigenous suicide and the importance of culturally led responses in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander suicide prevention. Pat, welcome.
There, I'm unmuted. Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Jackie. Look, I'm going to sort of segue off your comments. I think that, racism is such a reality for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. It's just everywhere, and there's different forms of it too. We've got direct racism, and that's alive and well, may I say, direct racism. I did a tweet last week just celebrating our Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project, and all these racists dived in on there. I'm badging them. I'm calling them racist. And we're saying things like, oh, this is a waste of taxpayers' money. Why don't you guys go to and fix things up in Alice Springs, which is another whole story. And I'd respond saying, sometimes I said, why don't you go then? But I actually did respond and said, the community, the local community needs to address the issues. And if we're called in, we'll certainly go. But the government needs to sit down with the local community and talk about what the issues are and what the solutions, both sort of short-term and long-term. So it just showed to me that people were quick to judge a situation because they already had preconceived ideas, and all they saw was a negative picture of youth running amok in Alice Springs, when it's actually much more complicated and much more complex than that. And I'm pleased to see some of the media now is covering that properly, talking to the people, the families, and calling for local engagement, because we know that unless you have self-determination, any group of people who are oppressed, unless there's self-determination, it's very hard to change things. Any human being needs to be in charge of their own destiny. They need to be to feel that they have a say in what's going to happen to them. So that was one of the big key messages from ATSIPEP, as Julie spoke about. I've only got a little while, so I've got to decide what I'm going to talk about. Look, I think that we spoke when we got ready for the webinar, and we're going to definitely come from different angles, but there is still very overt and direct racism that's always happening for our people. There's systemic or institutionalized racism, and we see that play out. There's been a lot of research done about this. We always felt it was so, but now we see the research that shows it. As Jackie said too, there wouldn't be many Aboriginal people who haven't experienced who haven't escaped the experience of racism. That's a given for all of us in one way or another. But I want to talk about cultural racism and historical racism, because I think that gets overlooked, and it's probably the bedrock of the whole, issue of racism that is prevalent. And I'm hoping that people who have joined the webinar are not denying racism, because another argument I had on Twitter was someone who said, how can you speak so badly to people on this forum when and they couldn't see any racism. And so I went and cut and paste. Sorry, this is a crow that lives in my garden, and he's decided to be noisy. I might have to run up to the bedroom or something. I don't know why he starts now, but anyway, and they couldn't. So there's a challenge. First of all, if you do respond, and because I said it's not my job to educate racists, if they don't like my post, jog on, leave. And so that came across a bit tough, I think. But people were saying that our projects were a waste of taxpayers' money and all sorts of other things. So I thought that was fair. But there's a denial of racism as well. They could not see that as being racist, and I end up giving up on it. I did cut and paste and show her the examples, her or he, I don't know. They're all anonymous out there. But that's something you can't even do a social media post, and nameless people are piling on. But just to say that the origins for us in any case of racism, it's not a new issue. I think it went underground and it wasn't talked about for a while. But racism has always been there for us. It started with colonization, and I think the whole colonial mindset was to see Indigenous people as somehow inferior, that Western society was doing us a favour by coming in and taking over the land, because we weren't doing anything with it, anything of use. So there was all these judgments and values that the only right way forward was a westernized ones. So it was easy to do the terrible things that were done to any colonized group, but particularly to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. And that stayed with us. That's the beginning of that's the Australian history, and we haven't looked at it and addressed it properly. But we're not the first to talk about racism. I want to just mention Kevin Gilbert, who was an Aboriginal activist back in 1977. He wrote this brilliant book called Living Black, and he went all across the nation interviewing different Aboriginal people, and he was looking at Aboriginal identity in particular. And he stated very brilliantly that when invasion occurred, Aboriginals began to sicken physically and psychologically. And he said they were hit by the full blight of an alien way of thinking. They were hit by the intolerance and uncomprehending barbarism of a people intent only on progress in materialistic terms, a people who never credited that there could be cathedrals of the spirit as well as stone. Their view of Aborigines as the most miserable people on earth was seared into our own thinking as well, because now they control the provisions that allowed blacks to continue to exist at all. Independence from them was not possible. So that was back in 1977, and we know that one of the denials of the history is that our resistance to colonisation. So that is all. He went on further. I don't know what my time's like, Julie. You'll give me a signal, yes?
Yeah, soon, Pat.
Yeah, he was actually naming up some of the big issues we know, like, intergenerational trauma. He said it was his thesis that Aboriginal Australia underwent a rape of the soul so profound that the blight continues in the minds of most blacks today. And it is this psychological blight more than anything else that causes the conditions that we see on the reserves and mission. And it is repeated down the generations. So, you know, from his amazing journey across the country and talking to Aboriginal people, he was naming up the things that we now commonplace, you know, about intergenerational trauma. He was doing truth telling in a time when there was a total denial of that. So we're not the first to talk about racism and to protest. There's other historical figures, male and female, and I'm glad to see that history now is starting to emerge. But it is the cultural racism is the point that you think your culture and its ways is the superior one and any others are really odd or inferior, strange and unacceptable. And so people are not accepted in their own rights. And even if we know that there were assimilation policies, but regardless, even if you, I think from my research, even if you played the game, you were never accepted in any case. So that's the situation where the situation is. So I think the reclamation of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander culture is very important. And for us as scholars to start challenging the Western notions of psychology, of selfhood, of everything. We need to be critical thinkers and to also bring forward an Indigenous knowledge and value that Indigenous knowledge and paradigms that talk to us about who we are from an Indigenous standpoint rather than a Western one. So I'll leave it at there and let, I think the next speaker, Tanya. Over to you, Julie, our moderator.
Yes.
And now the crow's gone. Oh, no, I spoke too soon.
It's always good to hear the wildlife in your garden, Pat, and it was particularly good to hear that history of cultural racism in the country that we're living in. It's so important. You talked as part of your description of that book, Pat, about how racism affects people physically and psychologically. And I'm just going to add in here before we go to Tanya, a couple of statistics from your work, Pat, and elsewhere, which I think are really important for people on the call to know. Research by Yin Paradis found that Indigenous children exposed to racism were at 41% increased risk for emotional and behavioural issues. And there are consequences of that. 31% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults go on to have high rates of psychological distress. That's twice as high as other Australians. Aboriginal people are twice as likely to die by suicide across all age groups, but among children and young people, the disproportion is even higher. It's up to 4 times as high. So I think we need to put that on the record for context, and also to say that in the latest Closing the Gap report, the one that's just been out a couple of months, we're going backwards in terms of suicide and social and emotional well-being for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Going forward, making some progress in many of the domains of closing the gap, but not over psychological well-being, and racism has an important impact on that, clearly. I'm now going to introduce Tanya Hervinen. Tanya is a proud Jaru and Bunaba woman from the Kimberley region, born and raised on the lands of the Kalkadoon people in Mount Isa, Queensland. Tanya is a clinical psychologist and a researcher. She's got expertise in mental health, social and emotional well-being, and suicide prevention, and she works with people impacted by trauma. She helps workplaces to bring cultural and clinical knowledges together, advocating for more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social and emotional well-being practitioners, and for building the skills of mainstream organisations to provide culturally supportive care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Tanya.
Thank you, Julie, and just wanted to salute and honour Jackie and Pat as well for your contributions. Certainly, actually segueing certainly off Jackie and Pat, acknowledging that racism exists absolutely within Australia, but looking at the ways that it can manifest in workplaces. So workplaces are very reflective of Australian society, and having the ability like when we look at racism as a whole in Australia, it's overwhelming and it's big and it's here. But what can you do? What's your spheres of influence, and what can you do as an organization? And there's a lot that you can do. It's such an opportunistic space, and you can actually very much influence the culture of an organization and a workplace to be racism free. Just also reflecting on what Jackie was sharing about her child and Pat about racism, we certainly got to see racism within the workplace during the referendum last year in 2023 and then leading into 2024. Again, there's lots of data that is around sharing those increases and experiences of racism and discrimination, and also people actually witnessing racism within the workplace. Again, it is a big issue. So what you need big efforts to address racism in workplaces and in organisations. Hearing Jackie, we need to hear these stories, Jackie, and again, honouring what you shared, and we're very blessed and honoured to hear what you shared with us. We need to hear these stories to hear how it actually can impact at an individual, family and community level, because we need that empathy so that we are motivated to care enough to do something about it. Again, hearing from Pat about those psychological and physical impacts of racism certainly contributes to our education and awareness that racism exists. So now that we know it, what are we going to do about it? To tackle it, there needs to be accountability. What happens in workplaces when this occurs? What are the pathways to addressing racism for people that observe it, but also people that are on the receiving end of racism? So strategic investment in time, commitment and resourcing is absolutely necessary. And also understanding the difference between equality and equity. It's very different to be treating everyone the same versus leveling those fields of play. So again, needing certain resources and commitment for certain spaces within the organisation. I think the other thing where racism, it can slip under the radar is that there's a perception that racism only occurs when it's motivated by hate or dislike and those sorts of things, which it certainly is. There's no question about that. It's certainly, there's a space for people that feel a particular way against different cultures and different races. But racism can also occur without people even knowing. So we have these terms such as unconscious bias, or when there's even good intent. So when there's good intent, racism can still occur. So that's why we need education and resources around what does racism actually look like and how is it expressed and how is it operationalized within organizations. And again, such a space of influence that can make a difference if people actually, or organizations and CEOs and executive and boards put time and attention towards this. And can you imagine if all workplaces have anti-racism strategies, that ripple effect that can have along the rest of Australia. I also want to shout out to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practitioners online, and just a little shout out to Matthew. There's some deadly Aboriginal psychologists that might be joining us tonight, and also acknowledge all the people that do so amazing work, and thank you for listening. So thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Tanya, for those comments about where the responsibility really lies, and they lie with our organisations. And for anyone who's working in an organisation, that's a very good place to start to tackle this issue. We're starting to get some questions through on the Q&A. Please keep them coming. We are responding to a few of them directly, and some of them we're going to, the panellists will respond to live in just a few minutes now. But before that, we're going to go to our final panellist for this afternoon, and that's Professor Ian Hickey. Ian's a co-director of the Sydney University Brain and Mind Centre. He's a psychiatrist and he's a prominent public voice on mental health issues. Ian was an inaugural commissioner on Australia's National Mental Health Commission overseeing mental health reform, and he was instrumental in the early development of both Headspace and Beyond Blue, those mental health organisations you're no doubt familiar with. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks so much, Julie, and thanks to Pat and Jacqueline and Tanya. I'm sitting on the lands of the Gadigal people here in the Eora Nation, and I remain endlessly grateful that my relatives washed up on these shores a few generations ago from the British Isles and Ireland, and I've been fortunate to live here ever since. I constantly learn from Jackie, who reminds me constantly, geez, you white blokes are funny. You want to know, are you okay? What we actually want to know is, are we okay? Are we collectively okay? Pick up a point that Pat has made, I think it's about the collective well-being. Now, when it comes to hard issues and hard discussions like racism, rather than asking the question, am I a racist? Or what have I done? Or what am I responsible for? There is the collective, what have we done? What are we responsible for? And whose responsibility is it to respond to these issues? I think we have to first by recognising it's been a really tough 2 years, the last 2 years, for those people from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. As we have seen, I think, as Pat alluded to, things that perhaps have gone underground or under the surface resurface. In the debate around the referendum and the voice proposition and the generosity of the Uluru response to the heart, clearly very overt racism reappearing, and then a kind of denial, very active denial of the ongoing impacts of colonialisation, of disruption of the policies. And as Pat so elegantly put it, a rejection of cathedrals of the spirit in favour of cathedrals of stone and Western ideas of high culture versus what's to be valued. And the impacts of colonialisation, which have been seen in terms of the impacts of colonialisation, of Western colonialisation right around the world, and increasingly recognised, and the different cultural assumptions that have sat behind that. And it's institutional forces, it's religious forces, it's assumptions about what would represent progress, and the impact on disruption of communities and the perpetuation of that on an ongoing basis. So grateful to Jackie raising the particular issue of the Northern Territory intervention, of the ones that Jackie raised about education. Often you might see things that were well-intentioned, but are absolutely racist in their implementation and their assumptions that sat behind them. And of course, those things are alive and well in Central Australia today in response to violence, response to youth problems around the country, that the intention itself may be well-intended in one sense, but may be fundamentally racist in its application. So I think the reason I'm here, I'm not an Indigenous person, I think I'm part of the we. The problem here is not for Aboriginal people to solve. Australia has a long tradition, for those who are old enough, you know, two Wongs didn't make a white. We've had a long racist tradition against many different groups where the Western dominant white idea of all sorts of people who are different, and of course the most fundamentally different, the people who inhabited the lands for the previous 60,000 plus years, that somehow they didn't belong and we did. And the institutions that we bought and the institutions that we continue to promote retain many of those attitudes. So the reason I'm here is to ask everybody else, not, are you a racist? Or I don't have to worry about this because I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist. You know, I don't think like that. But what about the institutions I work in? I work in the health system. We see the health consequences all the time of Aboriginal people who are afraid to use those services because what those services have done in the past to people. Jackie's made fear of the police systems, the justice systems. What happens in the education systems? To help you, we'll put you apart and treat you as different. Families in social services, the assumption that you're dysfunctional families. What are the ways that we behave in the institutions that we support that perpetuate racism, even when good intention, they perpetuate the systems and that give rise to the ongoing health consequences? Julie raised the closing the gap issues. We're not making progress on many of the issues, and we don't want to have the hard conversations. We don't want to have the hard conversations. I was reminded of this just recently. I had the pleasure by accident of watching Paul Keating's Redfern speech from 30 years ago, saying until we move to saying what we have done, picking up Pat's point, what we have done, who are of Anglo-cultural backgrounds, and the institutions that we continue to support, and reflect on what they continue to do. Not am I a racist, but are these systems that we're running have intrinsic biases and intrinsic difficulties that play out in the lives of Aboriginal people every day. Unless we recognise that, the responsibility here for change is not with First Nations people. The responsibility is with those of us who are privileged to sit within and have benefited from those major institutions to go, hang on a second, what have been their consequences? The recognition, the truth-telling that Pat was alluding to, but as Tanya and Jackie were alluding to in their real lives, What are the ongoing everyday experiences of young Aboriginal people now, of families now who bring their families forward into or require social services or require health support or require educational services? What is happening in the workplace? So the reason I'm here is what are we? You know, the 97% of people who are not Aboriginal, what are we doing in the systems in which we work to change those experiences, to recognise what has been the reality and what is to be done collectively, informed by and led by First Nations people? What is to be done differently? So every time we have a crisis at the moment of young people in Central Australia, which is not different to the crisis we've had in the past, or the crisis as they're perceived, what is the way in which we would do things differently to recognise the harm that's been caused, but respond productively and proactively and in not racist ways to those crises, rather than falling back on the ways and the assumptions that we have had? So hopefully my presence is about asking the 97% to reflect on that, not to ask yourself whether you're a racist or not, but to say, what is it, the systems that I'm working in the mental health systems I'm working in, this is incredibly apparent. The work of Pat and others in social and emotional wellbeing to change the language in mental health, to try and change the experiences, to try and have practitioners working in those areas, to try and create services in which Aboriginal people would feel safe, to try and create services in which Aboriginal people, young people, would be prepared to engage with services, to change the services in ways that would not behave in a racist way and would be welcoming and would not be experienced as racist by those young people who may wish to use those services. So what I guess the issue is for me and for people like me is, what are we doing to accept what has been the reality and remains the reality for many First Nations people, and in what way can we contribute to changing that?
Thank you, Ian, and that's a really valuable and timely reminder for those of us who are the other 97% of the country that we do have a continuing and collective responsibility. Thank you for those comments. So 4 powerful reflections on racism and its impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia today. We're going to go soon to the questions that have been coming in on our Q&A. But first of all, I'd like to invite any of the panelists to address a question or a comment to each other. I just wonder whether there are some threads of that conversation that you would like to pick up between the 4 of you before we open questions. Pat.
I think that we're going to make available resources, and prior to the webinar, I was Googling around, and there's some excellent resources out there. The Human Rights Commission's got Racism, It Stops With Me. So there's a lot of resources around for, starting to tackle racism, just to make that note.
Thank you, Pat. And Pat's right. We will absolutely distribute an email to those people who've signed up using their email after this event with some links and things that came up during the event. So if there's anything that we've mentioned that you particularly want to see, please put that in the Q&A as well. Oh, sorry, Jackie. Sorry, I hadn't muted myself too early. Jackie, please go.
I should have used the proper hand up. And look, I think maybe a thread that I'm seeing here is what can we do? What can the 97% do? But also, what can we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do? Well, I'm going to say get involved in using learning something about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. I answered a comment that someone asked a question about, what sort of active things, what resources could you provide for schools? Well, we have, as I was saying, I was writing years ago, this framework for teaching Aboriginal languages and Torres Strait Islander languages in our schools. And the reason why I was so keen to do that piece of work with the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority was because earlier I'd been involved I'd written a syllabus for New South Wales, that meant that the Aboriginal languages of New South Wales could be taught in our schools. And we found that schools where Aboriginal languages were being introduced as a natural part of the curriculum, kids were learning about their local language. It actually decreased racism in the places where the languages were being taught in schools. So, for example, in Western New South Wales, in Wiradjuri country, schools where Wiradjuri was being taught did little surveys of, I guess, student attitude and local community attitude, towards the Aboriginal students in schools and the community in general, and found that as languages started, the Wiradjuri language started to be something that more and more people, not only Aboriginal people, but the wider community knew about and were able to use a bit of, people became much more engaged with who and what are the local Aboriginal people in their area, and the local Aboriginal community felt quite empowered because there was their beautiful language being used on a daily basis in all sorts of spaces, kids greeting each other at school. Apparently in one school, I think it might have been in Young, the school students themselves advocated with the local council to get signage put up in Wiradjuri language saying "Welcome to Wiradjuri country," and and people have gathered together to find out what the names of local places are in Wiradjuri country. So there are now dual named geographical features like Gunnabulla, Mount Canobolas in near Orange, in Western New South Wales. So, this basically, it means that, if you know something, if you speak to, I remember, I think it was Nelson Mandela who said, if you speak to a man, he said, but I'll say to a person in their own language, you speak to their heart. So I think that our Australian languages, because that's what the Aboriginal languages and Torres Strait Islander languages are, they're actually the Australian languages. Get with the program, everyone, and engage with our languages, whether you're Aboriginal or not. And I'm very proud that most people who go onto the campus of the University of Sydney know that that is Gadigal land, and that this, as I said, the plant behind me, the Xanthorrhoea, provided by our Deputy Vice Chancellor Indigenous, I have to say, is the Gadi, and that's what those people are named for. People are so much better informed these days, and that's been a very recent development. So I encourage more of that. If you understand people through their language, you will also understand their culture, and that sort of institutional racism against Aboriginal culture that both Pat and Tanya talked about, the sort of belittling of our cultures, can be addressed by sort of understanding us through our languages.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jackie, for those excellent comments. I'm going to move soon to the Q&A that are coming through. We've got some really interesting perspectives here. People have seem to have mostly addressed their questions to the whole of the panel, but we won't have time for everybody to answer each question, so I might direct the questions towards individuals. We've got a question from Aero, who's 23 years old, lives in Mpantwe or Alice Springs, which, as Aero writes, is currently under a government youth curfew order. Question is, how do we as individuals, workers, and as communities move motions to dismantle present-day applications of structural violence? Thanks for sharing. And Tanya, I'm going to address that to you first of all. It's a very large and very hard question, I think, but you were talking earlier about some of those structural issues within a community, and it would be great if you could address that. And perhaps if I may tag on a sort of supplementary question here, if you can perhaps mention any examples of organisations that you think are doing that well, have begun that process of the hard scrutiny of themselves that they need to do to change.
Thank you, Julie. So a little bit close to home, my mob are not from the Aranda Alice Springs, but I have a lot of family in Tennant Creek's kind of just down the road. Family go back and forth from Tennant Creek or TC to up to Alice Springs, so a little bit close to home. But I think I might defer to Pat. I think, Pat, you were talking about the work of the communities having the local solutions, and there's engagement and self-determination. I mean, you've talked about that publicly with some of the posts that you've been sharing recently, and so I'll defer to that. But also, you're in Alice Springs, so your spheres of influence and what you can do within your. And I think, Ian, you talked about it as a worker. What can you do as an employee? What can you do as a person? What can you do within your organisation? And again, many hands make light work. So what you can do and that momentum change, and it does start with all of us. That's probably the best that I can do, and might ask Pat and.
I think we can do it together, Tanya. And I think your point about, become an ally, and, there's lots of information about how to be a good ally. But in that particular situation in Alice Springs, it is a complicated issue. And I put out a post recently today where, and thank goodness that local people now are speaking up. So everyone's jumped in and given an uninformed opinion of everything. But it's the local people and local organisations, and particularly the families involved, that have to lead the discussion. The post I put out, there was a young youth worker who said, okay, let's have the curfew. It is a good circuit breaker, but that's a short-term solution. It's a Band-Aid on a huge wound. It's deeper and longer than this. So what happens when the curfew's lifted and all the government attention moves back to wherever or onto the next hotspot? What happens to the youth in Alice Springs? So I think that the government and the power need to sit down with local community. They know all the issues. We don't. That's why when people were calling for us to go to Alice Springs, what am I going to do? Give some pontificating advice that's probably not well received. We go in when we're asked in. Otherwise, we become like mission managers, who are trying to tell people how to live their lives, and it is Band-Aids, or you might impact on a couple of people, but you're not addressing whatever the core issue is. The community and people involved will tell you that. So it's patience, listening, and then putting into action resources to ensure those solutions start going into actions. And it's pretty simple, actually. And, on my, when I had those racist posts going last week, people were saying, that's not enough. So your answer is just have a talk with the community, and that's the solution. And I said to one of them, I said, well, what's your solution then? And I was hoping they'd say send in the army or something that I could screenshot useful examples of racism in other situations. But they said, no, you're just deflecting. And the answer is, I said, look, the answer is you've got to sit down with the local community, talk to them, treat them like, I didn't say this, it was a short post, but you treat people like human beings and listen to them properly, and then put that, whatever you've heard and you've checked back with them, into action. So that's part of the solution. And I think to recognise that history too, I think a lot of Australians have blinkers on, and we see these, there's always an incident in the paper, always, or in the media, deaths in custody and so on. But it's like you're fighting it uphill all the time. All our people, these terrible injustices that are still occurring, racism in the sport. So it's a never-ending carousel of examples which have impact on us too. We're not divorced from it. Of course, we care about Alice Springs. Of course, we care about our sports people who are subject to racism. They're a part of us as well. So that does vicariously, we suffer that trauma as well. We're not exempt from it. But I think that to become a good ally, to ensure that you've got open heart and open ears to listen and do what you can do. As you said, Tanya, everyone's got a role, and even if it is to write a letter or to know that you have informed yourself, and that's an important first step. I'm a bit concerned about how we bulletproof our youth from racism too. So even though when I Googled around, there's lots of research on racism, there's a lot of good advice for to become anti-racist. But I think, well, what are we doing for our youth directly to bulletproof them a bit? But over to you, Tanya.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Ian or Jackie if they wanted to share anything. Sorry, Julie.
Well, just on the focus on Alice Springs at the moment, right around the country, we have all sorts of responses. So we saw in Queensland a little while ago, the response to difficulties there was to support incarceration of young people. So the community response, which was seen as being most politically attractive to the Labor government in Queensland, was to talk about increasing rates of incarceration of young people. So we get the same kind of responses. It's not isolated. It picks up Pat's point. There's always a very negative picture of a particular thing. And then there's a ferocious, like, law and order response or over the top kind of response. And obviously, we just got to reflect the rest of us as to why that is politically popular. Like, what is in it for a government in another jurisdiction to say, well, what we'll do is lock more of those young people up. In this case, young Aboriginal people. We'll lock them up, so that we get this perpetuation. And it picks up Pat's just second point. I think we can't underrate the ongoing impact of that the historical and cultural stuff is being lived continuously around the country in the negative portrayal of each of these incidents. Pick up Jackie's point about the positiveness of language, of culture, of physical signs. Clearly, the other side is the positive portrayal of Aboriginals who are incredibly successful, and the celebration of that and the presentation of that, the active presentation of functional communities. Pick up Jackie's point, community concern, the concern for others, and the positive portrayal of that, not just simply that will teach another generation to behave differently or will teach another generation not to be racist, but clearly there's a problem in the way that our society doesn't represent the positive portrayal of aspects of Aboriginal culture and socialist culture and of success and of caring for each other. Things I think Jackie raises constantly in the research I'm involved with her, of the positive aspects of the mob taking care of each other. And that might be a lesson to the rest of us who are more disconnected. So I think Pat's kind of issue about the bulletproofing is actually celebrating the positive aspects of Aboriginal collective culture for young people and the turn that, and we need to find more opportunities to be allies in that, to be affiliates of that, to find opportunities of portraying the positive while calling out the very negative and often short-term political opportunism and media opportunism that sits around the negative aspects.
Could I just say that deficit discourse is so destructive? I never cease to be amazed at people seem to think that I have got the jobs or have had the jobs in my life, the employment that I've had, and also the educational opportunities. I went through and did a PhD through the, as did everybody in this group, really, through the university system. And I did that because I worked hard and I guess I had the interest, aptitude, you could say, to do it. And my mother particularly sacrificed a lot to pay for me to be able to have that opportunity. It wasn't because I was given an advantage as an Aboriginal person or that I ever had to trade on being Aboriginal. It just, for me, being Aboriginal is a great positive in my life, a personal positive, and I think it does enhance the lives of everybody around me. I'm able to share and the experience of being Aboriginal, but also about, my cultural knowledge, about language knowledge particularly, and share my international experiences with other Indigenous peoples. But I, first and foremost, it's I guess, I don't live in a deficit, but most people treat me straight away when they know I'm Aboriginal as somehow being in deficit. And I'm a professor at the University of Sydney. So if that's my experience, imagine what it's like for people who haven't had those educational opportunities, who are these kids under curfew in Alice Springs. They're just assumed to be, as my daughter was assumed to be when she went to school, irrespective of what her background was or what her family was doing to support her, that somehow she just wouldn't achieve. So the thing that I think is saddest in Australia is we're wasting this wonderful resource we have, which is all our people, our Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We have so much to offer this country, and the recent failure of that referendum, I think, is it really is a huge indictment on a very large number of people in this country who are clearly very racist. They don't think that we should have any responsibility in the management of this country. That would have to be the most racist thing that I think Australia's done, perhaps in the entire nearly 250 years since the British invaded this place, to be told that we just don't have what it takes to be included in the governance of this country. Is extraordinary. The governance of a country we governed for tens of thousands of years very effectively. So it's that underlying, I think that's something we're all saying, this underlying deficit discourse that sits with us as Aboriginal people is really incredibly destructive, and it wears you down.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you so much for pointing that out, but also for emphasising the strengths in Aboriginal communities, which is a great point for us to be starting to wrap up this session. We're coming to the end of the hour, unfortunately, and sadly, we're not going to be able to address all of the questions, though the panellists have addressed a number of people directly, and thank you very much for doing that. And thanks to everyone who's made time to join this important webinar event today. We've had around 100 people online. You know, that's an impressive number. And thank you for all of your interest in this. We're going to be making the video of this event available through the Brain and Mind Centre website, and we'll be sending a notice out about that to those who've joined with their email address. Please share that widely with your friends and colleagues. I know we've had a lot of interest in this topic, particularly from organisations who want to know how to manage these issues within their entities. So we hope that that's a sign of things are looking more positively in the future. Thanks also to the Brain and Mind Centre and the Centre of Best Practice teams for making the webinar possible. But before we go, and we've got only 2 more minutes, I'm going to ask everyone to make one final summary comment about what they'd like the audience to take with them. And Pat, you're going to, I'd like to call on Pat first.
Yes, because I'm frantically waving. Geez, that went too quickly like the last webinar we did. What I'm going to suggest is that we do another one, a follow-up. I feel that we barely touched on topics, so I'd like to see another one. And I was hoping, probably foolishly, that we'd be able to do a call of action from this webinar. So maybe it comes from the next one, or we present a call of action at the next one. So I think that it just felt we were starting to get into some good conversation, and we had to end it. So I'd like to see that continue somehow, and for us also to do a call to action.
It's true, Pat, an hour goes by very quickly when we've got excellent panelists of this caliber. A final comment from you, Jackie?
Call of action. I'm just going to echo that. That's absolutely what we should be doing. Yeah. Thanks, Pat.
You. Thanks, Jackie. Ian?
I'd love to see people from the Governor-General, Prime Minister, or Governor-General designate now, Prime Minister, actually do what Jackie said, actually speak in Aboriginal language. If you think of other countries at the moment, around the world, Maori, French Canadians, other areas, what's changed in a lot of other countries to recognise the importance of the culture is to have the leaders of those countries speak in the original languages of those countries. That kind of thing, coming out Pat's point about where young people learn from, it isn't just in school, it's what they see every day. And I think we could change some things very quickly by the leadership of the country, ignoring some of the negative media and speaking in the languages and using the symbols of the original people of these lands.
And we've got a new fabulous Governor General.
And we have a Governor General designate who I think might be up to that. But I'd include prime ministers and premiers and others who actually, when they start official events, start in the languages of the people who originally lived here.
Well, the word makarata is the word that the Yolngu mob use for that. Yeah, a call to action and in language. So.
Let's talk about that call to action and how we can make that happen. Final comment from you, Tanya?
Thanks, Julie. Just say thank you to Pat, Jackie and Ian. And again, I echo call to action. Now that we know it, what can we do about it? Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. We've been listening to Jackie Troy, Pat Dudgeon, Tanya Hervanen and Ian Hickey. Thanks everyone for being with us tonight. And we will be in contact soon.